Welcome to the Point Podcast. We have informed, intelligent conversations about today's financial topics submitted by viewers like you. Let's go ahead and get started. Here are your hosts, Landis Wiley and Alan Wallace.
Hello, and welcome to The Point, sponsored by Basepoint Wealth. I'm your host, Landis Wiley, sitting here as always, Chief Investment Officer Alan Wallace. We thank you for tuning in. This is our first episode since the big election.
Yeah.
So, as always, we've received lots of questions and comments from folks that tune into this, as well as the team members around here. And I bet folks out there can't guess what we're going to talk about today. But we'll get to that here in a little bit. For those that are new, format here at The Point, really simple, actually. We just like to sort of demystify topics around finance, the economy, markets, what have you. All based around questions that we get from you who are tuned in, as well as the advisor teams here and the clients that work with Basepoint. So before we get into today's topic, we always kick this off with a brief segment from Alan on the most important thing that's affecting the world of finance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan. What's our most important thing?
The most important thing right now is credit spreads. Credit spreads tell us how much we are getting compensated for taking on the risk of default in non-government bonds. Spreads are organized by credit quality, starting at the best possible credit quality, or AAA, all the way down to D, which means the issuer is already in bankruptcy. BBB is the lowest rating that is still considered investment grade. Credit spreads are very tight right now, which means that we are not receiving much compensation for taking on the additional risk of default. AAA spreads are currently at 0.32%, BBB spreads are currently at 1%, and high-yield spreads, also known as junk bonds, currently average 2.69%. When spreads expand, the price of bonds with credit risk go down, and when spreads contract, the price of these same bonds goes up. With spreads as tight as they have been since 2007, there is little room for improvement, and historically, if we enter a recession, credit spreads will expand significantly, causing significant declines in current bond prices. We continue to hold very little credit risk and are monitoring spreads for signs of expansion. We will not add significant credit risk until we are adequately compensated for the risk of default. Keep your eyes on credit spreads heading into the new year and the new presidential administration.
Imagine having the peaceful rhythm of ocean waves as the soundtrack to your well-earned retirement. Helping make retirement dreams come true, Basepoint Wealth fee-only advisors provide you with independent and transparent wealth management advice, because from here, you can go anywhere. Schedule a complimentary consultation with a Basepoint Wealth advisor now at basepointwealth.com. Basepoint Wealth is a registered investment advisor. Visit basepointwealth.com for important disclosures.
Great, Alan. Thanks for that. We'll pay close attention to what happens with interest rates and bond spreads going forward. So it'll be interesting to see here in the new year. So again, thanks for tuning in here to The Point. Once again, for those who may be new, Alan and I just like to sit and talk about all things finance and economy and markets. Happens all the time. And so the point of this whole podcast has always been to just welcome you into the conversation and join along. Topics, we never really know what we're going to talk about. It's always coming in from folks that are watching the podcast, from clients, from the advisor teams that are here. Obviously, being our first episode back post-election, big topic on everybody's mind, big topic in the news, of course, is the outcome of the election. And sort of the policies that have been proposed by what looks to be a Republican sweep of the White House, the House, and the Senate, which we talked a little bit about that dynamic in the last episode. But we did get several questions around how those policies may impact markets and may impact the economy going forward. And so we've kind of pulled that together into what we think is an interesting topic, kind of wide-ranging. And really it boils down to, now that we know that Donald Trump is going to be the 47th president, it looks that Republicans will also have the House and Senate. What are the implications of some of the major campaign promises that have been made, specifically around implementation of tariffs, reducing the size of the federal government, cutting taxes, and the potential for efforts to deport a large number of undocumented immigrants that have come in over the past several years.
That's quite a bit.
It's a lot. It's a lot. And obviously, it's been a big focal point in the news and in the headlines since the election. Some of the initial nominations for key cabinet positions. There's been a lot of focus around the Department of Government Efficiency involving Vivek Ramaswamy and of course, Elon Musk. And I think everybody is kind of wondering how all of this could potentially play out and impact us going forward.
Yeah, so I think what we probably need to do is take them one at a time and then take them together, right? Because you've got a bunch of different moving parts here, and they don't all move the ship in the same direction.
Right.
So it's a little bit more like a blender.
Right.
And then you also have the economy itself, and then markets are sort of a derivative of the economy. So just because something helps or hurts the economy doesn't mean it's going to have the same impact on markets, whether you're talking bond markets or stock markets or commodities markets or those type of things. So, I mean, I think what we should do is address them maybe one at a time, and then sort of think about how they would act together.
Sure.
And I think the overriding thing we have to keep in mind here is that markets hate uncertainty.
Right.
And when you have a bunch of competing policy proposals here, and you don't know how things are going to end up, then typically that's going to be a check mark in the bad column when it comes to investment markets.
Now, one thing, obviously our focus is on the financial impacts of all of this, not so much the politics that go around it. And most of these topics, there's at least some historic precedent for a lot of them. Right?
Sure.
So I know you're probably one of the most well-versed people that I know in the history of all things finance. And so I think that'll be a valuable maybe point of view to share to give people some context as they're hearing about these things as we go forward. So.
Yeah, so I mean, from an economist's point of view, tariff is a bad word. I think Donald Trump himself said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. So you've got a big gap there between what the economists think and what the person in charge thinks. Because we've been in this sort of free trade environment since the post World War II order, I think we have a bias against tariffs, right? Because we've been told, even going back to my freshman economics class, that free trade is good, right? Now, good for whom is a separate question, right? Is it good for the entire world? Is it good for a separate population? And that's something maybe we're not going to be able to work out in advance. But oddly enough, the second law that Congress ever passed in the United States was the Tariff Act of 1789. Okay. So the first thing they did was they decided how to swear in officials. The second thing they did was they started slapping tariffs on things. And so we have a long, rich history of tariffs in the United States. Now, it's important to note that the Constitution gives the power of levying tariffs to Congress, not necessarily to the president, but we'll sort of get to that as we work our way through this really quick history, right? So 1789, we established the very first tariffs. 1828, we have the Tariff of Abomination Law, which is where the North sort of started fighting with the South because the North is industrialized. They want protection. And so they started putting tariffs on imported goods from Europe, whereas the South is exporting to Europe because they're agricultural. And so you have this competition between the North and the South because the South really did dislike the tariffs. The North really wanted the tariffs because it was protecting their industry. There's really two reasons why you do a tariff. One, to raise money, and the other is to protect industry. Well, the Tariff of Abomination of 1828 was clearly protectionist for the North only. And really that entire progression is what led into the Civil War, right? Because you started having things like nullification, where South Carolina said, we're not going to follow this law because it's unconstitutional. And that sort of led into 1861 when the next Tariff Act was passed, which is sort of how we paid for the Civil War. And then you get to 1930 and you have the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is like, every economist will tell you that that's what caused the Great Depression to happen. So, and then you get in the 60s, and so you've got the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. That's sort of where Congress started passing some of the control over to the president. So he can do what are called Section 232 tariffs, where he's trying to protect national security. And then you got the Trade Act of 1974, where now it's just if someone's cheating on tariffs, then the president can actually step in. And that's really where most of the tariffs that Donald Trump implemented came from, right? So those are the two, the Act of 62 and the Act of 74 are really where Trump is going to try to supersede Congress and add these tariffs. He's thinking about 60 to 100 percent on China, 25 to 75% on Mexico, and then 10 to 20% on the rest of the world.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of history on tariffs,
Right,
maybe
right.
too much, but
So, really since almost the founding of the country,
right.
we have a history of implementing tariffs for different reasons. You mentioned the 1800s, sort of the split between North and South, between
Right.
industrial and protectionist viewpoints on that. It's interesting because you fast forward to today and we don't have that delineation of North and South.
Right.
But certainly a lot of the, what seems to be from the exit polling from the election is a lot of Donald Trump's support came from maybe, the traditional Rust Belt,
Right.
the more industrial areas of the country, right?
Right. And those are the areas that have had their jobs sort of, removed over the last, 40 years.
Right.
I mean, if you go back to the election where Ross Perot was running, and he said NAFTA is going to be there's going to be a giant sucking sound, and that's all your jobs, heading to Mexico. Some of our viewers probably remember that.
Right.
Well, if you look at what's happened in the Midwest and the Rust Belt and those areas, I mean, there might have been some truth to what he said as far as that act was concerned. Now, I think there's probably been economic prosperity for some people, and maybe despair for others. So again, whenever you're weighing economic policies, you have to sort of balance between the winners and the losers, right? I mean, there's no such thing as an economic policy that's just good for everyone. There's always, and then there's also unintended consequences, right, which sometimes are difficult to measure. So, but yeah, I mean, the country ran on tariffs until 1913 when the 16th Amendment was passed, right? I mean, before the 16th Amendment, an income tax was actually unconstitutional. So we ran on tariffs and excise taxes from 1789 until 1913-14 when the income tax sort of started taking over that ability to raise income.
Right. So one of the things that has been floated out there by some in that circle is exactly that, of this notion of, could they abolish the income tax as we know it and replace it with revenues from tariffs?
I don't think the numbers quite work out just based on the amount of imports that we have. I mean, we import just under $4 trillion a year in goods, and the federal budget is, significantly larger than that.
Right.
We've got, I don't think we have enough trade activity in order to basically replace all the income that we would need to from the income tax. We're raising somewhere around $4 or $5 trillion a year in income tax, which is, equal to the amount of imports that we have.
Right.
So,
well, and when you talk about, prior to 1912, really say prior to 1920 era, when the bulk of the federal government was funded through tariffs, certainly the scope of the federal government was substantially different than what it is today. Which obviously is another part of this question, is getting into reduction of the size of our government in a way. But before we get to that, so from a tariff policy perspective, what's the most, the argument seems to hinge on that we're being treated unfairly by other countries when we try to export our goods that are made here into those countries. Many of them apply their own tariffs onto our goods.
Right.
And we're not necessarily doing the same coming in. And so therefore it's disadvantaging producers here relative to their counterparts overseas. Right. And therefore companies are moving jobs into the places where it's cheaper to produce the good and then shipping it back in here. And it's not really costing them anything to do that. And so our workers, wages are being impacted and so on and so forth. That seems to be kind of the argument around why we need to revisit and look to expand the tariff policy. If they were to move forward with that, what's the most practical, immediate impact if some of these tariff proposals actually were put into effect?
Yeah, so I mean that is the important thing, right? Is you have to think about short-term, medium-term, and long-term consequences, and some of those are a little bit more clear or obvious than others. Mm-hmm. But the fear is that the tariffs will be inflationary, right? So if you slap a 20% tariff on something, the price immediately goes up 20%. That's going to get passed on to consumers. Data shows, though, that tariffs are really more deflationary than they are inflationary, and the reason for that is because people don't just pay the extra 20%. They might buy substitute goods, or they might go without, right? Or they might, buy a lesser quality brand. And so in general, the tariffs themselves tend to be deflationary. And the data from the Trump tariffs of 2018 show this. The data from the 1930s show this. During the 1930s, we had one of the largest periods of deflation ever, and that's because economic activity is slowing down, right? So there's less pie because that tariff is sort of causing a frictional cost on all the goods that are being traded. So, I mean, I think that the fear of immediate inflation is probably misguided. Now, you may have some industries where once the tariffs are implemented, all of a sudden they start to produce things domestically. The goal here is that companies are going to move their production into the U.S. Right? The goal isn't that we're going to penalize them and we're going to keep the tariff as the tax. This is purely protectionist type of maneuver. And so the goal is that Toyota is going to build their cars here instead of building them elsewhere and then moving them into the country. So if the intended consequence happens, then what we should see is increased employment.
Right.
If we have unintended consequences, we might see decreased employment because we might have retaliation from other governments that say, well, now your goods are going to, you're going to tariff us 20%, we're going to tariff you 20%.
Right.
And so then companies that export a lot of goods are going to, start to see slowdowns and probably have to reduce their labor force.
And we've already seen some of that even in anticipation of these policies. I believe it was, John Deere, locally, John Deere was one that announced that they were going to shift a significant amount of production into Mexico.
Right.
Ford was another one. And they've since scaled back some of those, or at least said that they intend to revisit, those announcements kind of in light of this. So, would you take that as supporting, or I guess evidence of what you're saying, where the end goal of this may be that these companies ultimately choose to move those productive capacities back into the U.S. just to avoid that tariff?
Well, I'd say we're not even in the first inning. We're maybe at the singing of the national anthem here. So it's really hard to tell. Right. These are all sort of anticipatory moves, and it's difficult to say, how it'll shake out. But sure, I mean, I think that's the goal, right? The goal is that there's more jobs here. And if there's more jobs here, then the communities are more solid. Tax revenue goes up, and so but it's good for certain pockets of the U.S. population, but maybe not for the country as a whole. And it's good for some people, maybe not others. I mean, people who are used to being in those type of factory jobs. Having those jobs come back may be very helpful for them. But you might have lack of training. You might have you're gonna have the costs of building and putting factories back online, those type of things. And I think the other thing is that we've got some key industries maybe that we shouldn't be importing, especially like the precursors to medications that are mostly coming from India and China. We had some events during COVID where those companies or those countries stopped allowing exports. And so I think that there are some true national security concerns here as far as medications, as far as computer chips. And I think we're supposed to try to build 20% of the advanced chips in the U.S. by like 2030 or something like that. But I think having a manufacturing base is probably a good thing, right, especially in a period of geopolitical turmoil. And we've got wars in Eastern Europe, we've got wars in the Middle East. China is sort of saber rattling and talking about taking Taiwan, which is where all of our chips come from. So I do think that returning the U.S. to a manufacturing base is a positive thing. It's just, is it worth the price that we have to pay over the next 5 or 10 years in order to get there?
Right.
But there's no question that the protectionist policies of the 19th century are sort of what fueled that economic engine that we had going into World War II, right? And so that doesn't necessarily mean it was the most efficient,
right,
but for our population, it was probably a positive. It moved people from the farms into the cities.
Right. So the initial thought behind that is okay, tariffs get established, certainly with you would assume with a longer term goal of trying to, repatriate some of the jobs that go along with it. So initial revenue impacts, probably revenue positive,
right,
from the government perspective, from the budget perspective, from the tariffs that are initially being paid. Idea behind that is eventually those tariffs, if that policy works, and theoretically all of that were to come back, well, those tariffs are going to diminish.
Right.
But behind that, the increase in labor, the increase in production here should shift then the ability to collect additional tax to sort of offset that diminishing tariff, right?
Yeah.
So look, I guess when you look at that, one of the problems that's underpinning all of this, that's in the background, is deficit spending. Right. Annual deficit, it peaked during COVID, obviously, with PPP and a lot of the stimulus spending that was done out there. That's continued. We're now sitting at between $2 and $3 trillion in an annual deficit.
It actually went down last year, and I think the estimate is about $1.75 trillion for this year. But you never know until you get the
rounding errors. Right?
Right.
I mean, at some point, just take a zero off the end of it. But so it seems as though we need more revenue. Tariffs would certainly be a way to get there. Getting more income, more jobs to come back here to generate more income tax would certainly be a way to do it. But fundamentally, we have a lot of spending.
Right.
And which kind of then, I guess, is tying into a second piece of this, which is reduction of the size of the federal government. Because you kind of, we talked earlier there about, the entire federal government was really funded by tariffs up until the early 1900s, but it was a much smaller enterprise.
Yeah, I mean,
than
it was nothing like it is today, right?
So recent data shows that there's approximately 3 million federal employees.
Right.
There's another 6 to 7 million contractors that are essentially doing the work of the federal government, but not directly employed by the government.
Yeah, those are mostly defense and healthcare.
Right. So, figure 9 to 10 million, somewhere in that range of, folks that are being paid by the federal government to do things, to provide the various services and what have you of the government. You've got another 10 to 15 million.
I've heard 16 million local and state
on local and state. Yeah. So you put all that together, you've got close to 25 million people employed in government at various levels in this country, which is sort of shocking because what's the total employment base of the entire country?
It would be 62% of 330 million. So, 180-ish.
180 million.
Right.
So you've got well over 10%.
The number I read was 16 to 70% of the labor force is employed by the government.
Okay. So, and obviously that has been on an upward trajectory considerably over the last 4 to 5 years post-COVID. I think we've seen a tremendous spike in that, but really you could trace that back into the 1960s and 70s as far as some of the government agencies starting to blow it up. So this idea of going in and slashing the federal government, Elon Musk, I think people are probably familiar with the Twitter story, right? He took it over and he slashed 80% of the workforce. And the argument is it works better and it's more innovative and, far more cost effective. I don't know that you could walk in and, or that the desire would be to slash 80% of the government workforce by any stretch. But if you were to look at the tariff conversation as a revenue generating opportunity, and you were to look at, are they going to approach and be serious about implementing cuts to the federal government, the two potentially together maybe work towards closing that deficit. Now, whether they get there or not, that's a whole other story. Sure. But I mean, what's the practical impact of walking in and cutting 10 or 20%?
Well, the immediate impact is higher unemployment. Right. So these are people that are making on average $70,000 to $80,000 a year, which is higher than the median household income in the United States. So these are good paying jobs. And there's, somewhere around 10 million of them. And so you're going to have, some percentage of 10 million people immediately unemployed that were earning somewhere around $70,000 or $80,000 a year. So that's immediately going to probably be deflationary and recessionary, right? Because you're going to have less people employed in the labor force. The second thing is, and there's a couple different layers of cuts we're talking about here, right? There's employment, right, and then there's just outright terminating agencies. Right. I read that no one actually knows how many federal agencies we have. There's no list, but it's somewhere around 435. Right. 435 federal agencies that do all kinds of things, right? And so you're going to have less services. Now, whether those services are necessary or whether they're worth the cost, I would say some are probably more important than others. But, I once saw an interview with Milton Friedman, and the person was asking him, hey, which federal agencies would you get rid of? And at the end of the conversation, there were 4 left. So we're somewhere between 4 and 435 is probably the right answer. We just have to determine which of those services are meaningful and which ones are worth the money that we're paying for them. So immediately higher unemployment, and then less services for people. Depending, and some of those are going to be more important than others.
Mm-hmm. Well, and certainly that's going to draw a headline, right?
Sure.
I mean, the spike in the unemployment rate, you can pretty much anticipate how that's going to play out across the nightly news, right?
Yeah.
So certainly there's some political dynamics that are going to go into that type of
it's going to be an uphill battle, right? Because there's no way, I don't think there's any way to implement all these policies without having negative headline numbers print, right? And so the headline is going to be policies are failing. Right. We saw that in Argentina, right? Where they came in and they started just closing down government agencies. Inflation was somewhere around 26%. And all the headlines immediately were, this isn't working, because all these economic numbers are getting worse. Well, eventually inflation fell all the way down to 4%. Right. So
and that's been relatively quick. I mean, that's only been underway down there for about a year. Is that
right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's going to be very difficult to monitor the situation and know what's working and what's not working, especially when the media is diametrically opposed to the administration. If that continues to be the case, there have been some signs of white flags being waved. So it'd be interesting to see how vehemently the media tries to fight this. But I definitely there are going to be levers in government that are going to try to fight it, right? And we're already seeing that with the nominees for the cabinet positions and the officers of the United States. There's already a lot of fist waving and tooth gnashing as far as who the people are that are being proposed, right? So even at step one here, we're already sort of having some
self-preservation, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, nobody wants to lose their job.
Yeah, 10 million people here whose jobs are on the line, and you would expect them to try to fight for that.
Right. Well, it'll be interesting to watch. What do we sense is if the feeling is there's going to be a lot of noise as this unfolds, especially initially.
And maybe some pain.
Some
real pain.
And Elon Musk and others that are involved in putting this strategy into effect, I don't think they've been shy about that. Elon himself was on a podcast and flat out said that it would be a period of pain.
Yeah, right. Which is a talking point that can be immediately turned against him, because when a billionaire tells 10,000 heirs that they're going to have to feel some pain.
Right.
There's an immediate ability to point out hypocrisy there.
Right. Well, we're very unused to anybody in the political system being willing to express that there might be some bumps before we get to the positive.
It's always about the next election, right?
Correct.
There's never a period where you're not campaigning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, as we look at that, we always talk about separating signal from noise, right, and lots of things. So if we can reasonably anticipate that the noise is going to be very loud, right, and it's likely to be very negative and very pessimistic, thinking a little bit here about, you have the economic factors, the deflationary potential of this, the recessionary potential of it. Shift and let's think about the markets a bit here. How can we anticipate that the markets will digest this? How will they work to separate, are these policies going to lead to a more stable, productive, stronger, sustainable economy, which is the argument, right? Get away from deficit spending, which is highly inflationary, and get us to a point where, our government isn't driving inflation by way of overspending. How will the markets work through that?
Well, like I said at the beginning, the markets hate uncertainty. And so, you have to take a look at valuation. And, if the market is cheap, it can stand a little bit more uncertainty than when the market is expensive. And I don't think there are any metrics by which you can measure the S&P 500 and say, this is a cheap market that we're dealing with. So, I definitely think that if you're indexed in a broad sense, especially capitalization weighted indexing, you're probably going to experience some volatility here, especially if there's uncertainty. And so you have to, make the decision of whether you're just going to try to ride that storm out or whether you're going to try to make some some shifts in order to limit volatility. I mean, we don't invest in those kind of things. So, I mean, I think we're sort of positioned for volatility. We have significant cash. We've got short-term, high credit quality instruments that can be redeployed if we get discounts in market prices. We have gold and silver. So if there are inflationary pressures, we're going to be okay. So I mean, I don't think we need to make any large shifts here based on possible volatility. We've been waiting for volatility for a year or two, but to the average investor that has their 401k 80% in the S&P 500, which is 35% 10 stocks that are highly dependent on technology, I think that there's definitely some danger in that.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and go on to kind of another hot button one that's been floated, which is the topic of immigration.
Yeah.
Certainly there's a strong case and fact-based case that our country has been built on immigration, really from its founding. We have a long history of, welcoming immigrants into the country, or at least wanting immigrants to come into the country. In recent years, most of the focus has moved past the legal immigration conversation, and it's turned the focus to large numbers of undocumented immigrants that have come in. There's really no definitive number of how many have come in recent years.
10 to 11 million is what I hear.
Right. And I think that's a number that they feel confident in saying.
Right. But it could be double.
The counter to that is nobody knows the numbers that they haven't had contact with.
Right.
Either way, it's a large number, right? I mean, you just think about 10 million. That's basically 3 states of Iowa, right? That have crossed over a border or entered the country in some way.
That's any time over the last 40 years, though. So
correct. Yeah. So that's a large impact. In recent years, there's been varying times where the focus has come on housing shortages, and certainly, even if you were to bring 1 million people into the country in a relatively short period of time, the question is, well, where do they go, right? So as we look at this, part of the conversation has been we need to get this under control. It's having lots of impacts. The arguments are, wage suppression, of American citizens because you have now lots of people competing for jobs. Part of the proposal that's been put forward has been not only to secure the border, but to go to the next level of saying we need to start removing people that aren't supposed to be here. And that's really something that hasn't been attempted, en masse in this country for a long, long, long time, right?
Right.
What is that? I mean, from a policy perspective, what does that look like? What's the impact to our economy if we were to move forward with efforts at large scale deportation or removal?
Sure. Yeah. So the number that I see is somewhere between 10 and 11 million. It could be, that could be double that. Who knows? And that 60% of that population is employed, right? So that's 6 million people with jobs. Now, those jobs, on average, that are held by undocumented immigrants are in the $20,000 to $30,000 a year range. So significantly below that number for government jobs, right? So, but your unemployment numbers are going to start to go up again, right? So if you have the combination of removing undocumented immigrants and firing government officials, all of a sudden you've got this weird dislocation in the labor market where, you've got a bunch of jobs at the lower end of the pay scale, usually agriculture, construction, hospitality, that are going to be open. And then you've got all these unemployed people at the upper end of the income scale who are in defense, manufacturing, healthcare. And so you're going to have sort of a dislocated labor force. You're going to have a bunch of job openings at one end of the scale, and you're going to have a bunch of unemployed people at the upper end of the scale. Now, whether or not some of those people filter down into those jobs or whether they start forcing the cost of those jobs up and it sort of meets somewhere in the middle remains to be seen. But if you had 6 million immigrants removed from their jobs, and you've got, let's say, 4 million, 5 million government employees that are suddenly unemployed, I mean, you're going to have a problem there, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, I think immediately you've got all these jobs that aren't going to be done anymore. That's going to be maybe inflationary because you're going to have supply constraints, right? So all of a sudden, the things that these people were doing are no longer available. And so you're either going to have wage pressure on the upside, or you're going to have shortages on the agricultural side. So, I mean, you have to be sort of careful what you wish for here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now there's something like 1.5 million undocumented immigrants who have already been served with deportation notices.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can start there. I mean,
Right.
there's already been a court order. There's another 1 million or so that have been, convicted or accused of crimes, either here or in their home country before they came here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, that's a logical second place to go. But, as far as someone that's already been here 20 years as a productive citizen, that's a tough question to try to answer, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, is the goal here to try to make us safer, or is the goal here to just be mean, right?
Right.
And you really have to think about, which of these different areas you're going to implement.
Right. Well, and something you mentioned there, this is probably one of the first topics where you've said that the potential impact here is inflationary.
Right.
Much of what we've talked about sort of counter to maybe what some of the narrative has been. Narrative is primarily around tariffs. Well, it's inflationary.
Right.
Narrative around, affecting the federal government is sort of all over the place, right? But primarily what you've mentioned is those effects could very well be deflationary or recessionary. This is the first time where we're talking about something that's inflationary.
So it has both, right? Like having less people here in itself is deflationary, but having the supply constraints and the wage pressures are inflationary. So again, you've got these competing forces,
Right.
and it depends on which of those variables dominates.
Right.
So again, more uncertainty.
Right. And maybe that's that's kind of the underlying theme here, as far as people are like, I think most people watch this, and part of the reason they're tuned in is, well, what's this going to do to my portfolio and what
Right.
have you? And you've said several times, markets, besides everything else, they generally just dislike uncertainty.
Right.
And it seems as though competing inflationary, deflationary pressures, I don't know how you get much more uncertain if you're the market.
Right.
Right. Of trying to figure out, well, how do I value something when I don't know what anything is worth potentially tomorrow or, a year from now. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's going to, I mean, that's the very definition of uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
More things can happen than will happen.
Right.
So we just have to make sure we're being careful, and we're always careful. So we're always prepared for this type of environment. And it's when our principles are most necessary.
Right.
So I don't have any fear of these sort of things, but I think the average person out there that's trying to do this on their own should have some fear, because, there's a lot of competing forces. There's a lot of variables that the magnitude is going to matter a lot more than the direction.
Yep.
And so, I mean, you really have to make sure that your portfolio is a balanced whole that is comprised of securities that are going, that are going to counterbalance each other in a wide range of contingencies.
And a phrase that we've used intermittently, but it's been a while around portfolio construction, is know what you own and know why you own it.
Right.
Right. And this is maybe one of those periods of time going into potentially a large amount of uncertainty, maybe to the degree that many of us haven't seen in our lifetime, let alone the period of time where, we have a portfolio that has a big enough number that we pay attention to it.
Right.
That it may be more important now than most to really understand what you own and what's there.
There's definitely a push here to change the status quo. And I think the post-World War II environment has been very, very stable. And I think in some ways unsustainable, because we have so much debt now in comparison to GDP. And so, I mean, this is the first real effort I've seen to come in and make some changes. Whether those work out or not remains to be seen. But at the end of the day, I do think that there is going to be some pain if these policies are implemented, if only in the fact that it's uncertain, right? Now, maybe all this stuff settles out, and in 2 or 3 years, we know what the outcomes are, and we're singing along. But historically, when you have a very large geopolitical shift like this, there are unintended consequences.
Well, and you mentioned earlier, there's no such thing as a policy that doesn't have winners and losers.
Right, exactly.
And part of, I think, what's underlying this is the changes that are being proposed very likely will introduce some degree of pain, maybe affecting some more than others. But it's probably also reasonable to say that continuing on the status quo, which is, led us to this very real and growing question of the sustainability of our debt situation in this country, I think we also need to acknowledge that continuing on that path very well entails its own type of pain.
Absolutely. And it may be more pain, right? Sometimes you have to make the choice of, do I suffer a small amount of short-term pain in order to avoid a catastrophe later, right? And we may be in one of those situations right now.
Right. So the last piece of this that was kind of built into this question is the question around tax policy. So last time that Trump was in was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I believe it was 2017.
It was.
That reduced tax rates broadly across the board, instituted some of the more hot button issues like the SALT tax cap, which for Iowans, even though we're not traditionally viewed as a blue state, we certainly have a high tax burden relative to a lot. So I think a lot of our folks have experienced that effect. So, coming up on the horizon, there is a lot of question around tax policy because that 2017 law does expire at the end of 2025, where many of the provisions of that reset back, which would result in an increase in effective taxes or for most everybody.
Right.
You've got the potential for a reset in things like the estate tax, which really hasn't been a topic of much discussion for most people over the last 4, 5, 6 years because the limits on the exemption have been so high.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the policy proposal, I guess, that have been put out. I mean, generally, I think a Trump administration, a Republican administration is viewed as lower taxes,
right,
less regulation, lower taxes. We've spent a lot of time here talking about the deficit, the impacts of spending, trying to create additional revenue. How do we square all this?
Well, I mean, if there is a significant reduction in the size of the government, then we'll obviously need less revenue. I don't think, Trump has said in some of his speeches that he would like to get rid of the income tax, but I don't know that that's going to be feasible. That would definitely require Congress to play along with that. So I'm not very optimistic about that. Now, getting the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extended, I think that's probably doable. And that's a very subtle, that would be a subtle shift. I mean, it's not going to be a gigantic increase or decrease for anyone. I mean, I don't think that they let the estate tax limitation go back to $1 million or below. When I first started in this career, it was, I think, 600,000. And so a lot of people that I was meeting with had an estate tax problem, and we had systems in place that we had to use in order to avoid that. And then, we've sort of gotten out of the practice of doing that as this thing has ballooned up to $26 million now or something like that. So if that returns significantly down towards impacting most of our clients, we have experience dealing with it in the past. We'll have to, just dust off some of the techniques that we used to use. Right. So that's not the end of the world. But I don't think given our spending and giving the composition of our spending, how there's all this talk about cutting the government, but remember, a significant portion of that is interest on debt, Medicare, Social Security, and defense.
Right. And
those are going to be very hard areas to cut. So I really think you only have 20 or 30% of the entire pool that's even up for discussion. So, there are very large limits to how much you're going to be able to cut spending.
Right. So if they were to come in and make an effort to extend the existing tax rules, probably doesn't change a whole lot.
No.
I don't know that there's been a whole lot of discussion around them trying to go further with tax reduction.
Trump has said that he wanted to reduce the corporate tax rate even further, I think down to 15%. I believe it's at 21% right now.
Right.
But that's the major proposal that I've heard. Hey, but, there's been a lot of talk about things like getting rid of tax on tips, getting rid of tax on Social Security. Those may just be campaign speech items. I mean, getting that built into a comprehensive tax law might be a lot more difficult than it sounds.
Right. Well, you touched on something there, and I think it fits around this overarching topic, and I want to hit on it just here for a second. You mentioned in there that the composition of our spending, which is underlying a lot of this push, right? The argument around a lot of these policies is our government is too big, we spend too much money, the debt is going to wipe us all out, right? And so we're going to try to pull on all these different levers in various ways to try to address that, along with some of the ancillary issues around immigration and so on and so forth. As you look at that, I think, I've seen numbers that interest on the national debt is now in excess of $1 trillion. Right. There's a large wave of outstanding U.S. debt that matures over the next couple of years. It has to be refinanced. Much of that debt is sitting at 1% to 2% interest rates.
Right.
That very likely, as of now, would be refinanced at 4% to 5% interest rates. So the potential for the composition of that spending is to become even more difficult to chip away at,
right?
Because so much of it is out of our control. We have entitlements, we have Social Security, we have Medicare, military spending. All of these things, much of it is sort of baked in. Sort of tying into it is this question that's also out there around pressure that the president may choose to exert on the central bank around interest rate policy.
Yeah.
Certainly if they were to go in and lower interest rates to zero, there's an argument out there of, well, that takes care of the interest piece of this.
Well, they only control short-term interest rates, though. And the more that they've been lowering short-term interest rates, the higher long-term interest rates have been going.
Right.
So
we've seen that since September.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think, what are we up, 80 basis points?
Yeah.
Or something like that? Somewhere between 65 and 80 basis points, depending on the day.
Right.
Be careful about thinking that the Fed can control the interest that we pay on our debt.
Right.
Now, they can on short-term debt, but the longer-term debt is a little bit more nebulous.
Right. And unless we want our government to basically be perpetually refinancing 3-year Treasury bills, or three-month Treasury bills, probably not the best approach there.
Right.
So, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think the takeaway is the next several months are going to be fascinating to watch. Obviously, we don't know where any of this is going to go. Lots of proposals. Nominations seem to be the nominations that have been put forward so far seem to be in support of taking a serious effort at addressing a lot of these issues.
Right.
But certainly we don't know where that's going to go. Right.
And one thing that we only mentioned in passing that I think is probably the most important is the reduction in actual regulation. Right. I mean, last I checked, there's something like 180,000 pages of federal regulations.
Right.
Talking about everything from, cabbage to, I mean, all these sort of.
Our tax code is 10 million pages long now. I was reading that.
Right.
I mean, that's craziness.
Right. But I think making it easier to get things done. If you look at what it took to start an airport in the 1940s, it was basically you went out and bought an airplane, right? And now there's so much paperwork, so much red tape that it's impossible for any. Now you may say, "Oh, I want that because it's safer," but I mean, I think some of the regulations that we have here, like, it takes 2 years to be able to cut hair. I mean, so, that's not a federal regulation, but still, I mean, it's very hard to get anything done. And that hurts construction. That hurts innovation. It hurts technology. And so I really do think that moving away from that regulatory state is what's going to be most beneficial here to all of us.
And a lot of that obviously is going to be dependent on Congress playing along to a degree.
Well, the regulations are in the executive branch, right? So those are written by the departmental agencies. Right. So I mean, and that's one of the things that Obama did really well. Well, I mean, did effectively, I guess, in his administration he was pumping out thousands of pages of regulations every year. And so, when you look back and look at the legislative landscape, other than the Affordable Care Act, there wasn't a lot of legislation, but there were thousands of pages of regulations entered into the record. So one of the things that Trump and his team want to do is just start taking the weed whacker out to all those sort of burdensome regulations that are holding back the gears of commerce.
Right. Well, and in theory, that sort of dovetails into reduction in federal government size, right?
Right.
In theory, if there's less regulations to enforce, you need fewer people to sit around and enforce them.
That's the theory, anyway.
That's the theory.
Yeah.
See how it works. So, well, it'll be interesting next several months to watch. Obviously, new administration, doesn't come in until January 20th. And then it's a long slog through the political machinations of our system of cabinet approvals and what have you.
I mean, it's going to heat up a lot, right? Depending on whether or not we try to get recess appointments in, which there's a couple different ways to do that, but that's probably a conversation for a different day.
Right. Well, fascinating topic. Certainly one that, beyond all else, I think For those of you watching out there, I think we can take away from this is expect a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty, probably at least for a period of time as we work through this.
Yeah, and make sure that you stay in, your long-term thinking, right? Don't try to outsmart the market based on short-term moves, right? That never that's never an effective way to implement a strategy.
It's going to be very difficult to be able to accurately pick winners and losers as we go through this. So. Well, with that, hopefully it's been informative. I think we covered a whole lot of ground, certainly on a topic that is front and center for a lot of folks out there. So as always, we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us here on The Point. As always, if you have any questions or you're seeing things in the news or having conversations with friends and coworkers that you're curious about and you'd like to hear us banter about, feel free to visit our website, basepointwealth.com. And send in your questions, and who knows, maybe it'll show up here on a future episode. So until next time, thank you and take care.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Point Podcast, sponsored by Basepoint Wealth. As always, you can submit questions or topics you'd like to hear discussed to info@basepointwealth.com. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Basepoint Wealth LLC is a registered investment advisor. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Be sure to consult with a qualified financial advisor and/or tax professional before implementing any strategy discussed herein. Past performance is not indicative of future performance.